Good evening and welcome to League of Women Voters Presents. Our topic tonight is the constitutional amendments and one proposition on the November 8th ballot, and our guest is Mark Jones. He's the political director for Missouri National Education Association.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming, Mark. And we're going to kind of present Amendments 101 tonight. It's important that you vote November 8th, and it's important that you know what you're voting on. So in addition to statewide and national candidates for office and local candidates for office, there are several amendments, 6 amendments, I believe. Yeah, 6 amendments and one proposition. So Mark, I'm going to list the amendment, and you can tell me what it is.
Sure, you've got it.
So constitutional amendment number 1 has to do with state parks,
soil tax.
and water conservation.
Yeah, well, first of all, just thanks for having me. I really appreciate the league hosting this, and also I just want to encourage folks, these constitutional ballots, our constitutional initiatives are at the bottom of your ballot, so it's always important to go all the way to the bottom of your ballot, and I encourage folks to do that regardless of how they're going to vote on these initiatives. So Constitutional Amendment 1 is actually fairly non-controversial, and that's probably the last time I'll say that tonight. It's renewing a tax that's already in existence that helps our parks, soil conservation. There's no organized opposition to it that we've heard about or seen, and generally it's considered a fairly good thing for the state of Missouri in terms of preservation of soil, preservation of agricultural, or I should say public space and green space and waterways. And so you really see, I think, one thing in Missouri that has managed to transcend partisanship, and there's so few of those things these days, is a commitment to a lot of these park spaces and green spaces to preserve a rural way of life and a rural sensibility in the state. And I think you also see that in an urban area, there's a commitment to keeping these green spaces. And so there doesn't seem to be a lot of controversy around that one this time of year.
Yeah, and speaking with the proponents of this tax, and I think this will be the 5th time it's been up for renewal since it was first passed in the legislature back in about 1980, probably.
Correct. It's been around longer than I've been around in Missouri politics. So
Yeah,
it's been around ever since I can remember.
The 2 things that really stood out to me. One is the amount of topsoil, the value of the topsoil that it's saved, and therefore kept waterways in good shape. Hundreds of thousands of tons of topsoil. And then the other thing is our park system, our state park system, is one of the top 10 park systems in the country.
Universally considered one of the best in the nation. And I think anyone who's spent any time in Missouri, we're in Boone County in Columbia here, we certainly have been the beneficiaries of a strong state park system. You can drive 5 minutes almost in any direction and come across a great state park that has a lot of recreational activities for families. And so I think it's really that level of professionalism from the Parks Department, or for those who upkeep the parks, that really has kept that issue so non-controversial. There's a lot of value, not only from, like you said, the soil conservation, but I also think just an economic tourism. Having a strong park system is something that drives tourism dollars into the state, helps keep tourism dollars in the state for families, and we really have not seen organized opposition. In fact, what you see is really what I'd call very strong traditional grassroots support for the parks on the local level. And so in Columbia, you'll see groups pop up that are supporting the passage of this initiative. Right. And in other communities, you'll see that as well. So I really expect that for voters, the real decision here is, if you think the state park system is well maintained, do you want to continue that? And that's really the question I think you have to ask yourself. There's always an element in Missouri of sort of an anti-tax element. Right. I think that is not just unique to Missouri. And so anytime you have a tax on the ballot, I think those who support, who benefit from the services and who want to continue to see those services, continue, are always a little leery. But this is the one where I think there just seems to be a general consensus that this is a good system that's well run. Our parks are valuable and worth investing in, and certainly the preservation of the waterways as well, as we talked about.
Yep. Well, it's been renewed 4 times in its history, so.
Right.
And as you say, that may be the only non-controversial.
That's it. After that, there's going to be definite sides on, people are going to pick sides on the rest of these, I think.
Let's talk about Amendment 2. Since 2008, there have been no limits on campaign contributions in Missouri, correct?
Correct.
And this, for the first time in 8 years, would place limits on them.
Yeah, so Missouri used to have a fairly strong campaign finance system. So if you were a candidate running for office, you had limits from anywhere from $325 to $625, upwards to $1,000, depending on the seat you were running for. In '08, that was abolished by the legislature in a strangely bipartisan fashion. There were people of both parties who sort of supported this idea that, well, let's just report everything and that'll be okay. And unfortunately, I think we've seen in the system, what we've seen is an inflation in how much campaigns are costing all of a sudden at the state level. And there's been a reaction to that. So, state house campaigns back in '98, 2000, a very robust campaign might cost between $25,000 and $30,000, a very competitive campaign. And now we're seeing state rep campaigns routinely cost $250,000 in less than 16 years, since that time. So in '08, the legislature took off the caps, instituted some additional reporting requirements, but frankly, just not much. And so there's been a reaction to that. Amendment 2 has been mostly bankrolled by sort of a unique group. Normally you see these initiatives come out of what we would call sort of the political left. This one's actually coming from more the political right and is being financed by a gentleman named Fred Sauer, who is more connected with Missouri Right to Life. Now, there'll be some folks who will react to that, but truthfully, the initiative has some good parts to it, if you support campaign finance reform. It caps contributions, it eliminates corporate contributions, it also makes it very difficult for unions to contribute, which is sort of the traditional balance in Missouri politics. Obviously working for the Missouri National Education Association, I have a different view of that balance, but the initiative is, for all intents and purposes, designed to try to reinstitute caps for state legislative seats, judicial seats, statewide office holders. The devil in the detail is always in the details for these things, and what you're likely to see, I think, should it pass, is a lot of challenges to it in the court. Particularly in wave of Citizens United, sort of opening up the concept of what freedom of speech means. And so I don't think the passage of Amendment 2 is actually the beginning of the fight, not the end of the fight for the campaign finance reform issue. And I think there will be others who, regardless of what happens, will seek to strengthen Missouri's ethics laws, perhaps on the 2018 ballot or even the 2020 ballot as well.
So I understand that there's severability in this amendment, so if the courts find one part of it unconstitutional, they can sever that part.
Right, and that's usually done by inserting a clause that simply says, if literally what you just said, if the court finds something here unacceptable, the rest of this stands. However, if you pull out enough pins of anything, all of a sudden the framework may not hold. So it'll be interesting to see. The Missouri Supreme Court has had a pretty strong bend towards if something's been put on the ballot by signature collection like this was, and that the law itself is not inherently flawed in some catastrophic way, then it stands in the legislature, and those who want to conduct campaigns have to work around it. So it'll be interesting to see, I think, the day after this, what happens and what kind of actions and what kind of declarations you have from folks about their willingness. So for instance, when other issues like this have come to the ballot, many of them have not made it to the ballot because they've been caught up in legislation prior to making it to the ballot and being put on either the August or the November ballot. And so the one that comes most to mind is a few years ago, there was an attempt to put campaign finance limits on the ballot, and attorneys for Rex Singfield, who's a very prolific donor out of St. Louis, leans to the ideological right, and was the first to sort of start this wave of big checks coming into Missouri politics, didn't want to have that curtailed. And so we went through this weird, awkward phase also in the legislature, over campaign finance limits, where the limits were off, then they came back on in 1 year, and then they went back off. And during that time, you sort of saw, even with the most robust system, some strange things happen. So when the limits came back on, some organizations went out and filed 350 PACs. They created 350 new PACs in the state of Missouri and gave them all literally PAC number 1, PAC number 2, PAC number 3. And so there's always an attempt, I think, to move money into politics. The stakes are very high for a lot of people, but I think this is a well-meaning attempt. It probably has some flaws that'll have to be litigated.
So would this particular amendment prevent things like you just described, creating?
There's always loopholes. It's very focused on the idea of banning the source of money, whether that's corporate contributions or labor contributions, and it's very focused on how much a committee can accept and trying to get rid of loopholes that existed prior to 2008. So even when Missouri had campaign finance limits, there were some small loopholes where you could donate unlimited amounts to a political party entity, for instance. So you would see large checks go into both political parties and they get used in campaigns. I think it does a very good attempt to get rid of that, but that's sort of operating in an environment that's about 8 years behind the times. With what we've seen in the federal system, where you see what are supposed to be charitable organizations, 501c4s is what they're called, now do issue advocacy work or political work, and some people might have called this dark money, and it helps hide the source of campaign finance limits. This may not really solve that problem. I suspect as long as the federal system is broken, that it's going to be hard to regulate the Missouri system. Now that's not saying we shouldn't try, but that's always in 08 we didn't have that problem. If this measure had passed in 08, it probably would have had a lot more success in regulating Missouri politics than it will now in a post-Citizens United world, and an interpretation where you can have very large super PACs and these C4 organizations doing political work in a less accountable and less transparent way.
And Missouri is the only state without limits?
Yeah, I mean, my personal political history has taken me to, well, it's not the only state without limits. It's probably the most permissive environment. It's the only state without campaign finance limits that allows corporate contributions and has no ban or limit on lobbyist gifts. And that's a strange trifecta you don't see anywhere else. So a point of comparison is I worked on a campaign in Alabama. And I think we all have this perception of Alabama as probably the most deregulated environment maybe possible because of the political leanings of the state. Well, even they had a corporate contribution ban. Now they had no limits and they had looser reporting than we do. So it wasn't, I don't want to paint it as a paradise, but it's definitely a unique set of circumstances here in Missouri that we've somehow managed to entwine ourselves in, where you can write $1 million check one day to a candidate, you can buy that candidate any gift that you wanted to, and depending on the vehicle and mechanisms you use to do that, the reporting would be fairly lax, and that's probably not good for democracy just from a general point of view.
Yep. Organized opposition to this one?
There is some. I suspect, though, that mostly folks are thinking about a court challenge on Amendment 2. You're not seeing the same pushback you saw, partly because it's very unpopular to push against these things. So I think folks who may want to undo these will focus more on a court challenge and trying to take it from that direction than try to convince the public that corporate contribution bans are a bad idea.
That might be a hard sell.
That would be a little bit hard one, yeah.
Okay, we're going to take Amendment 3 and Proposition A together because they both deal with cigarette tax. Amendment 3 had a pretty attractive beginning, raise your hands for kids, early childhood education, but it's got caught up in some political problems.
It has, and so for full disclosure, my organization has come out against that. I'll try to speak as objectively as possible about it, but I think it started well-meaning, which is this idea that what we see is a desperate need for early childhood education funding. To do that right would cost about $1.5 billion in the state of Missouri. This only raises about $381 million, so there's definitely a gap there. However, this well-meaning idea, let's fund early childhood education, and you always have to find a revenue source. Missouri has one of the lowest tobacco taxes in the nation. We're only at 17 cents a pack. To put that in perspective, that's lower than the state of Virginia, or North Carolina, both places that actually have tobacco companies headquartered in them. However, they sort of got embroiled in a series of issues not related to early childhood education. So the first one is there's a weakening of the provisions around stem cell protection. Missouri was very ahead of the curve in 2006 and passed a ballot initiative protecting stem cell research in the state. There's some provisions in here that would imply that would weaken that and explicitly ban these dollars from in any way being involved in researches or therapies that involve stem cell. And I think there's a great concern that we've got these very strong constitutional protections, and even starting to weaken them is a bad way to move forward for the state if we're trying to preserve those protections.
Even though this money is earmarked for early childhood.
Correct. This money is earmarked to early childhood, and that kind of leads to, I think, the second critique, which is this. A lot of times when you pass something like, or when you're trying to pass something like this from just a purely political viewpoint, there's always a concern, well, if we hand this money to the legislature, they'll just play shell game with it, so to speak. So I think there was an attempt to put this money held it with a commission, much like we do transportation. However, the makeup of that commission is very disturbing to some. So it's a 13-member commission. Only 4 of them have to have an education background. And then when you're talking about $381 million, there's almost no restriction on the type of education program they can pick, if it has to be aligned with what the schools are trying to do, if it has strong research background and things like that. And with only 4 people actually having to have an education background, there's a lot of concerns in the education community about that. Additionally, I think there are some concerns around some language that got placed into it where there's a weakening of the firewall between church and state in terms of public money. And so Missouri, like almost every other state in the union, we have a very strong firewall that says you can't spend public money on private parochial schools, basically, when you boil it down. This creates a specific exemption for that money. And so for folks in the education community, that's been a big red flag. You don't create exemptions you don't plan on using, is sort of, especially in the Constitution of the state. And so I think there's a very strong concern around that. Now, the folks on the other side of the table, I think, are well-meaning for the most part, but they also have some partners who are funding this that I think give people pause, which is also buried in here is a section that basically has almost nothing to do with early childhood. Actually, it has nothing to do with early childhood. It is about two tobacco entities fighting it out over profitability. Right now in Missouri, if you're what we call big tobacco, sort of the brands you think about when you think tobacco.
The Winstons.
Yeah, the people that have big billboards and everywhere. They actually they pay a little bit more in taxation because basically from the tobacco settlement, they're required to because that's a penalty.
The national tobacco settlement.
Right. It's a penalty that they have to pay because, frankly, the documents they signed and the consensus, I think, of the public was they lied about the impact of tobacco on your health. Now, there's something we call little tobacco that was formed afterwards, has never done that, so never had to pay the penalty, and therefore there's a differentiation in how much it costs them to put their product to market.
And that's the off-brands.
That's, I mean, that's, I'm not a smoker, so I might be getting my brands, but I think it's more like your Cheyenne, your American Spirits, I think, are the brands, but I'm not a smoker, so if I did that wrong, I hope everyone will forgive me. But I think what you really see is sort of a cynical effort by big tobacco to use this early childhood issue. I think this is what really started rubbing people the wrong way, is to use this early childhood issue to sort of get a market share advantage rather than actually fund early childhood education.
Well, actually, little tobacco has a market share advantage right now. Well, maybe not share, but they've got a price advantage.
They have a price advantage, but it's based on, and this is a philosophical debate that I'm sort of on the side of, this isn't my philosophical debate, but I think little tobacco's position is, look, we never lied to the American people. We didn't, and we've never been penalized. This is a penalty, you should have to pay it. And that's for folks to decide how much that weighs in their mind. For me, it's more about, I think it's a bit cynical to use early childhood education funding as a vehicle to try to correct a court case and a document you sign.
We're one of the few states that
I believe we're the only one.
Again,
right.
Yeah, we treat the smaller brands differently.
We do, and that has a lot to do with that document and how it's been executed in the state of Missouri. We're venturing into the limits of my knowledge on tobacco, on the innards of tobacco law, but for those of us in education, our concerns mainly stemmed around the lack of an education voice on that commission, the fact that it was fairly unaccountable to anyone but itself. There's also some issues with when you have $381 million. That's a lot of implementation, and there's some concerns around that. I want to be clear. I don't think the people who from the early childhood side, I don't think they're bad people. I think they're trying to solve a problem. I think the coalition they ended up in has become much more complex than they envisioned. And while they may have a well-meaning, they may have gone in this well-meaning, the devil's in the details, like it is in all this. And
so briefly, let's talk about Proposition A, which is kind of an alternative to the that's floated by the convenience store industry. And
I think they wanted to put forward sort of a alternate proposal of what other things you could do. And also, when they wrote that, they wrote in a bit of language that says, look, if you vote for this one, this is it. This is what we're doing with tobacco money. And if you change the rates or start messing around with how much money you get, well, then this goes away and you have to resell this to the people of the state of Missouri. It basically, in short, would take tobacco money and put it into transportation, mainly highway transportation. It would go to MoDOT. It would go mainly to maintenance and upkeep and some expansion of highways. There's some differentiation in the amount of money per pack and the tax rates between these two, but I think in the long run, the issue is not about the competing tax rates. It's really about what are you trying to fund, and a lot of these side issues have seemed to have really entrenched the Amendment 3 folks as well. But I think Proposition A, there doesn't appear to be any organized effort. There was an organized effort to get it on the ballot. I don't think there's an organized effort to pass it. I think it's floated as an alternative idea for what could be done with this money. But I really think this is really about Amendment 3 when you really boil it down.
So Proposition A would raise the tax to 23 cents a pack, and Amendment 3 would increase it to 60 cents.
Right,
from 17.
Yeah, it's even different in the amount of money.
Yeah.
Like I said, I really think the crux of this discussion is less about the rates. And I understand why they're even still raising that money, which is that rate, which would make us significant. It would put us basically on par with states around us. But the real issue becomes about how that money ends up getting used. And Proposition A, it's pretty straightforward. It will go to supplementing MoDOT, essentially.
Yep.
And Amendment 3 gets a little more complex in the details.
So we're going to run out of time here, and we've got 2 amendments left.
I'll go fast.
Okay. Amendment 4 would prohibit any new sales tax on services or what's the word, or activity, whatever that is.
So this is an attempt, I think, by a lot of folks to do 2 things. One is, as we move to a more service economy, sort of wall off the service environment and say, look, as we stop making things and we start serving things and we start having more idea-generated items, that you don't get to tax those just because they're new and interesting. And also, I think there's an effort, a few years ago there was something called the fair tax or the everything tax, depending on what side you're on, proposed by Rex Singfield. To make that work, you had to tax these services. So to get rid of income tax, you had to tax everything else. So it doesn't matter if it was a Barbie doll or a hospital visit, you had to tax it. And this is an attempt to wall that off.
So the real estate industry is behind this.
It is.
It would tax doctor visits, all kinds of services.
Well, it would prevent a tax to doctor visits.
Right.
No,
I'm sorry,
no problem.
I misstated.
We'll get some angry phone calls from people later if we get that
understand.
wrong. But it would prevent any kind of service. So it wouldn't prevent a good, but it would prevent a service. So if you bring a plumber to your house and he puts in a new pipe, you're still going to get taxed on the pipe, but you're not going to get taxed on the plumber's time and the service they provided. And that's the current state of Missouri law. What their concern is that if some of these more radical tax ideas go through, where we get rid of the income tax for everybody and it has to be supplemented by a sales tax, the only way to make that work is if you tax every service. You can't. The math doesn't work otherwise, unless you want radical cuts to your local schools and items like that.
So this is a defensive move against flat tax.
Very much so. Yeah. Very much so.
Okay, in Amendment 6, voter photo ID. We kind of left the
one of the big ones for last.
Yeah.
So Again, full disclosure, my organization has come out against this. I'll speak from that side first. I think it's very concerning anytime you try to limit someone's fundamental right and the most sacred right they have, which is the right to vote. As this is constructed, it would spend about $17 million. That's the fiscal note that came through the legislature, so that's an independent body sort of self-evaluating what its own actions would cost. And more concerning to me is it would make it very difficult for folks that are disabled, that no longer have a driver's license, that no longer have a photo ID to vote. And that's usually people that you find on one of two places that are dealing with poverty or that are just older and no longer need to drive or have that photo ID. There's a very good chance it would disenfranchise about 200,000 Missourians when it's all said and done off the voter rolls. From a personal viewpoint, that's very concerning. I think we should be doing things in a democracy to make it easier for people to vote, not harder. The other side's rhetoric on this tends to run around this idea that there's voter fraud. In Missouri, in my lifetime, there has not been a prosecuted case of voter impersonation fraud. It's really sort of a $17 million problem, or $17 million solution in search of a problem. And so really, I think this is frankly a cynical attempt to try to shape the electorate to a political advantage. Yeah, like I said, full disclosure, my organization's urging people to vote no on this, but I find it hard to have another viewpoint around that issue. So, because there just doesn't seem to be a problem that exists here.
Yeah, and having said that, and I understand that, it's kind of, it's got an attraction to people. We want to prevent voter fraud.
And absolutely, and I understand that. I think one thing that is shared is like there's this idea that voting should be a sacred act, that it should be done privately, that it should be something that people enjoy and have full access to, and that it should be preserved. I don't think you preserve it by limiting the number of people that can have access to it. You know, the whole theory of what we do as a democracy is that we try to make sure that every voice gets at least an opportunity at the table to be heard. Whether or not your vote goes your way, that's a different issue. That's democracy. We all have had outcomes in elections we don't agree with, but we could soldier on. It's a very disconcerting idea to remove people from even having that level of input. And especially when you see that it's folks that are either dealing with economic hardship, or it tends to be folks that are on the tail end of their, they're disabled, they're elderly, and so they're dealing with those issues as well. And that tends to be the folks that are separated out of this, that are separated from their constitutional rights by this. And then we spend $17 million to do it. And so I'm hard pressed to see how that's a good investment in our democracy, spending $17 million to make sure less people vote that are qualified. And that's really that basic.
All right. Well, we've run through those amendments kind of at warp speed. There's a lot to think about, a lot to deal with when you go to the polls on November 8th. But please make it all the way down to the bottom of your ballot and vote your conscience on these amendments. Thank you, Mark Jones, for joining us. Very interesting. And thank you for joining us. Until next time, good night.